Before I begin, I want to say something. What you're about to hear isn't easy for me. I never thought I'd share this with anyone. But there was a moment, lost in the mountains of northern Minnesota, when I understood that some stories need to be told, no matter how much it hurts to relive them. I'll tell you something no one would believe, but every word I'm about to say is true. My name is Robert Harrison, and I'm 43 years old. Until 6 months ago, I was a different man entirely. What happened to me in those frozen woods changed everything I thought I knew about the world, about myself, and about the thin line between what we call real and what we dismiss as impossible. I'd been living alone for nearly 2 years in a small cabin I'd built with my own hands, deep in the Superior National Forest. After my divorce, after losing my job at the engineering firm in Minneapolis, after watching my life crumble piece by piece, I'd made a choice that everyone called running away. Maybe they were right, but I needed silence. I needed space to breathe without feeling the weight of expectations, without hearing the constant noise of a world that had become too much for me to bear. My cabin sat on the edge of a small lake, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks that had witnessed more winters than I could count. I'd chosen the location carefully, far enough from any trail that hikers wouldn't stumble upon it, close enough to water that I could fish and have a reliable source for my needs. The nearest town was Ely, about 30 miles south through winding forest roads, and I made the trip only when absolutely necessary, usually once a month for supplies I couldn't hunt, fish, or forage myself. Those first months of isolation had been exactly what I needed. I woke with the sun, spent my days chopping wood, maintaining my small garden, reading books I'd brought from my old life, and writing in a journal that became my only confidant. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of bird songs, wind through branches, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. At night I'd sit by my fire and watch stars that city lights had hidden from me for decades. I'd grown comfortable with solitude in a way that surprised me. My beard had grown long and wild, my hands had become calloused from honest work, and my body had adapted to the rhythm of seasons in a way my office-bound life never allowed. I felt strong, grounded, connected to something larger than the small anxieties that had once consumed my days. Winter arrived early that year. By mid-November, snow was already falling steadily, and the lake had begun to freeze along its edges. I'd prepared well, my woodshed was full, my pantry stocked with canned goods, dried meat, and root vegetables from my garden. I had enough supplies to last until spring if necessary, and the prospect of months of deeper solitude didn't frighten me. If anything, I looked forward to the profound quiet that only a snow-covered forest could provide. The blizzard began on a Tuesday morning in December. I woke to wind howling through the trees with a ferocity I hadn't experienced since moving to the cabin. Snow was falling so heavily I couldn't see the lake from my window, just a wall of white that seemed to swallow the world. The temperature had dropped to well below zero, and I could feel the cold seeping through the cabin's walls, despite the fire I kept burning constantly. For 3 days the storm raged without pause. I spent my time feeding the fire, reading, and listening to the wind speak in voices I'd never heard before. On the third night, as I was preparing for bed, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a sound like breaking glass, followed by a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The cabin shook slightly, and I felt my heart rate quicken. I pressed my face to the window, trying to see through the swirling snow. In the darkness, I could make out shapes moving in ways that didn't match the wind's rhythm. Something was out there, something large enough to disturb the storm itself. I told myself it was likely a tree falling under the weight of snow, but the sounds continued. Footsteps, I realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling my cabin. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin's timbers made me tense. Every shift in the wind's direction had me listening for something I couldn't name. When morning finally arrived, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it reached my cabin's windows. I spent the morning digging myself out, creating a path from my door to the woodshed and down to the lake. The physical work felt good after 3 days of confinement, and the brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow lifted my spirits considerably. It wasn't until I was heading back inside for lunch that I saw them, tracks in the snow that made my blood run cold. They were enormous, easily twice the size of any human footprint, but undeniably bipedal. The stride was impossibly long, and the depth of the impressions suggested something far heavier than any man. The tracks circled my cabin multiple times before heading north into the deeper forest. I followed them for a short distance, my curiosity overriding my growing unease, but lost the trail where they disappeared into a stand of dense pines. That evening, as I sat by my fire trying to make sense of what I'd seen, I heard the first call. It started as a low moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once, rising slowly to a howl that made every animal in the forest fall silent. It wasn't the cry of any wolf or bear I'd ever heard. It carried something unmistakably intelligent, purposeful, and deeply unsettling. The calls continued for several nights, always after dark, always from different directions. Sometimes they seemed miles away, other times so close I expected to see glowing eyes peering through my windows. I found myself sleeping poorly, starting awake at every sound, my rifle never far from my bedside. During the day, I discovered more tracks, always around my cabin, always circling, as if whatever was making them was studying me, learning my habits. It was on a Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the blizzard had passed, that I made a discovery that changed everything. While checking my snares for rabbits, I found something that shouldn't have existed. Another cabin, perhaps half a mile north of mine, in a clearing I could have sworn was empty just days before. The structure was ancient, built from logs so weathered they appeared almost black against the snow. Moss and lichen covered much of the exterior, and several of the windows were broken, their glass scattered on the ground like frozen tears. But what struck me most was that no snow had accumulated on the roof or around the foundation, as if the building generated its own heat or existed somehow outside the natural order of the winter landscape. I approached slowly, my rifle ready, calling out to announce my presence in case someone was living there. No response came, but as I drew closer, I caught a scent that made my stomach turn, something like rotting meat mixed with wet earth and something else I couldn't identify, but that triggered every instinct telling me to run. The front door stood slightly ajar, hanging askew on rusted hinges that squeaked softly in the slight breeze. Through the gap, I could see only darkness, but I felt certain I was being watched from within. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn around, to go home, to pretend I'd never found this place. But something else, a curiosity that had always defined me, pushed me forward. I called out again, louder this time, identifying myself as a neighbor. Still no response, but I heard movement from inside, not footsteps exactly, but a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across wooden floors. Against every instinct, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was larger than it appeared from outside, stretching back into shadows that my eyes couldn't penetrate. The air was thick with that putrid smell, now so strong it made my eyes water. What little I could see was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, as if the place had been abandoned for decades. But the scraping sounds continued, coming from somewhere deeper in the structure. I raised my rifle and called out once more, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space. This time, I received an answer, not words, but a low rumbling that seemed to come from the walls themselves, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. And then, from the darkness at the far end of the cabin, I saw movement. It emerged slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted me to see every detail of its impossible form. At first, I thought it might be a man, but as more of the creature became visible, that hope died quickly. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its frame gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, covered in patches of matted, dark fur. Its limbs were elongated, ending in hands that were more claw than finger, and its head was wrong, in ways that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing. The face was vaguely human in shape, but stretched and distorted, with hollow cheeks and eye sockets that seemed too deep, too dark. When it opened its mouth, revealing rows of yellowed teeth that were far too sharp, I understood with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. Something that belonged to nightmares and ancient stories, meant to keep children from wandering into dark woods. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I should have run. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run. But I found myself frozen, not just by fear, but by something else. A recognition that this moment was changing me. That whatever happened next would divide my life into before and after. The creature moved then, not toward me but to the side, circling slowly while never taking its eyes off mine. Its movements were fluid despite its skeletal appearance, predatory in a way that suggested vast patience and absolute confidence. It was studying me as much as I was studying it, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was finding me wanting. When it spoke, my entire understanding of reality shifted. The voice was like wind through dead leaves, like ice cracking on a frozen lake, but the words were unmistakably English, though heavily accented by something inhuman. "You have been walking in my woods for many days," it said, tilting its massive head to one side. "You have been leaving scents and sounds and disturbances, but you have not seen me until now. Why do you think that is?" I tried to speak, but found my throat completely dry. The creature waited patiently, as if it had all the time in the world for my answer. Finally, I managed to croak out, "I don't know." "Because I chose not to be seen," it continued, beginning to circle again. "Because I have been deciding whether you belong in these woods, or whether you are simply another intrusion to be removed." The threat was clear, but strangely, my fear was beginning to transform into something else. Not courage exactly, but a kind of desperate fascination. Here was something impossible, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, and I found myself wanting to understand rather than simply escape. "What are you?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. The creature stopped its circling and fixed me with those hollow, dark eyes. When it smiled, if that's what you could call the way its mouth stretched, I saw too many teeth, all of them sharp. "I am hunger," it said simply. "I am the winter that never ends. I am the thing that moves between the trees when the sun dies. Your people have many names for me, but the one that comes closest to truth is Wendigo." I'd heard the word before, in stories told around campfires, in documentaries about Native American folklore. The Wendigo was supposed to be a cannibalistic spirit, a creature born from starvation and desperation in the deepest wilderness. But those were just stories, weren't they? Legends created to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to primitive fears. Standing there in that impossible cabin, facing something that couldn't exist but undeniably did, I realized how foolish those dismissals had been. The world was far stranger, far more dangerous, and far more wonderful than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. "Why haven't you killed me?" I asked, and the question surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise the creature. It considered this for a long moment, head tilted again in that unsettling way. "A question I have been asking myself," it finally replied. "You are small and weak, and would provide little sustenance. But there is something else, Something in your scent that suggests you are not entirely like the others who occasionally stumble into my territory. What others? Hunters, hikers, fools who think the wilderness is a playground for their amusement. They carry the scent of civilization, of concrete and exhaust and artificial light. But you... It paused, nostrils flaring as it tested the air. You smell like someone who has chosen the silence, like someone who understands that the wild places are not meant for conquest. I thought about my 2 years of solitude, my deliberate choice to live simply and quietly, to take only what I needed and leave the forest as undisturbed as possible. Could this creature actually sense that difference? I came here to be alone, I said carefully, to live without disturbing anything. Yes, the Wendigo replied, and I caught something that might have been approval in its voice. The question is whether your presence is a disturbance by its very nature, or whether you might be something else entirely. We continued talking as the day progressed, and I found myself gradually relaxing despite the creature's fearsome appearance. Its intelligence was undeniable, and while there was always an undercurrent of danger in our interaction, it seemed more interested in conversation than consumption. It spoke of the forest as if it were a living entity, describing the relationships between predators and prey, the cycles of growth and decay, the delicate balance that most humans never noticed. Your people see the wilderness as empty space waiting to be filled, it explained as we moved outside, where it seemed more comfortable. They think silence means absence, that stillness means death. But every inch of these woods is alive with purpose, every moment filled with communication they cannot hear. As if to demonstrate, the Wendigo made a sound I can barely describe. Part whistle, part growl, part something else entirely. Immediately, the forest seemed to respond. Birds called from various directions, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and I could swear I heard trees creaking in response, their branches moving despite the absence of wind. The forest speaks to those who know how to listen, it continued. Most of your kind have forgotten how to hear these voices. But you have been learning, haven't you? I realized it was right. My 2 years of isolation had taught me to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. The subtle changes in bird songs that indicated weather patterns, the way different animals move through the woods at different times of day, the rhythms of life that operated beneath the surface of what most people considered empty wilderness. I've been trying to, I admitted, but I think I've been hearing only a fraction of what's actually there. The Wendigo nodded slowly. Understanding comes slowly to your kind, but the fact that you try, that you listen, that you take only what you need, this is why I have not removed you from my territory. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of orange and gold, the creature made an offer that would change the course of our relationship forever. Tomorrow, if you choose, I will show you things about these woods that no human has ever seen. I will teach you to hear voices you never knew existed, to understand relationships that bind every living thing in these mountains together. But understand, once you see through my eyes, you cannot unsee. Once you hear what I will teach you to hear, the silence you treasured will be filled with constant conversation. I should have said no. A rational person would have thanked the creature for sparing his life and politely declined any further interaction. But something in me, the same curiosity that had driven me to explore that impossible cabin, made the decision before my logical mind could intervene. I want to learn, I said. The Wendigo smiled again, and this time, somehow, it didn't look quite as terrifying. The lessons began the next morning, when I found the creature waiting outside my cabin, standing motionless among the trees like a shadow given form. In daylight, its appearance was even more unsettling. The patches of fur looked mangy and unwashed. Its skin, where visible, was a sickly grey colour, and its eyes reflected light in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of nocturnal predators. But when it spoke, its voice carried a patience and wisdom that seemed at odds with its frightening appearance. "First, you must understand that everything here has awareness," it began, leading me deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured. "The trees know when strangers pass beneath them. The streams carry information from the mountains to the valleys. Even the stones remember what has happened in their presence." As we walked, it taught me to recognize signs I'd been blind to. Scratch marks on trees that weren't random, but were actually territorial markers left by various animals. Patterns in the snow that told stories of hunts and escapes. Subtle changes in the way different areas of the forest smelled that indicated the presence or absence of water, food, or danger. "Your people think intelligence requires a brain like yours," the Wendigo explained, as we paused beside a massive oak tree that had to be hundreds of years old. "But intelligence takes many forms. This tree has been observing, learning, adapting for longer than your civilization has existed. It knows things about these mountains that I am still learning." To demonstrate, it placed one of its clawed hands against the tree's bark and made that strange sound again. I watched in amazement as the tree's branches shifted, snow falling from them in patterns that looked almost like communication. Other trees nearby responded similarly, and I began to understand that I was witnessing a conversation of sorts, conducted in a language of movement and sound that operated on frequencies I could barely perceive. "Can you teach me to hear it?" I asked, and the creature looked at me with what I was beginning to recognize as surprise. "Most humans do not even believe such communication exists," it replied. "You are certain you wish to learn?" "I am." Over the following weeks, my education in forest communication continued. The Wendigo taught me to distinguish between the various types of bird calls, which ones warned of approaching weather, which ones indicated the presence of predators, which ones were simply social chatter. It showed me how to read the tracks of animals, not just to identify species, but to understand their emotional states, their intentions, their relationships with other creatures in the area. Most remarkably, it began teaching me to sense what it called the deep conversations, the slow, patient communications that took place between trees, between the forest and the soil, between the water systems and the plants they nourished. These interactions happened on timescales that made human conversation seem frantic and meaningless, but once I learned to quiet my mind and extend my attention, I could begin to perceive them. The process was exhausting at first. My brain wasn't designed to process information on so many different levels simultaneously, and I often returned to my cabin with headaches that lasted for hours. But gradually, my perception expanded. The forest that had seemed peaceful but essentially silent during my first 2 years of residence revealed itself to be constantly alive with conversation, negotiation, and collaboration. I learned that the wolves in the area weren't simply hunting randomly, but were actually working in partnership with the ravens, who would scout prey from above and guide the pack to the best hunting opportunities in exchange for shares of the kills. I discovered that certain trees were what the Wendigo called message centers, serving as information hubs where chemical and electrical signals from across the forest network were processed and redistributed. Most astonishingly, I began to understand that the entire ecosystem was engaged in a form of collective decision-making. When food became scarce in one area, the various species would somehow coordinate to redistribute themselves to maintain balance. When disease threatened a particular population, other animals would adjust their behaviors to create natural quarantine zones. "Your scientists are beginning to discover some of this," the Wendigo told me during one of our long walks. They speak of mycorrhizal networks, of chemical communication between plants, of the intelligence of forests. But they see only fragments, isolated phenomena. They do not yet understand that consciousness itself takes forms they cannot imagine. The creature was a remarkable teacher, patient with my limited understanding, and never showing frustration when I failed to grasp concepts that seemed obvious to it. It had an ability to break down complex ecological relationships into terms I could understand, while never oversimplifying the profound mysteries we were exploring. But it was more than just an instructor. As the days passed, I began to sense something like friendship developing between us. The Wendigo would arrive at my cabin each morning, sometimes bringing gifts, unusual stones, interesting pieces of wood, once a feather from a bird species I didn't recognize. It would wait patiently while I completed my daily chores, and it seemed genuinely interested in my human perspective on the lessons we were sharing. I found myself looking forward to these interactions with an intensity that surprised me. After 2 years of solitude, I'd thought I no longer needed companionship. But the Wendigo's presence filled a gap I hadn't realized existed. Our conversations ranged far beyond forest ecology, touching on philosophy, the nature of consciousness, the relationship between individual existence and larger patterns of meaning. Loneliness, the creature observed one afternoon as we sat beside the frozen lake, is not the absence of others. It is the absence of understanding. You were not truly alone in these woods because you were learning to understand them. But understanding shared becomes something greater than understanding held in isolation. I realized it was describing exactly what I'd been experiencing. The forest knowledge I was gaining felt incomplete when I had no one to discuss it with, no one who could appreciate the profound beauty of what I was discovering. The Wendigo's companionship made every new insight more meaningful, every moment of wonder more complete. It was during the 4th week of our daily meetings that I witnessed something that would haunt my dreams forever, though not in the way you might expect. We were exploring a part of the forest I'd never seen before, a valley where hot springs kept the ground free of snow even in the depths of winter. The area was like a secret garden, green and lush, while the world around it lay dormant beneath layers of ice. "This place is sacred," the Wendigo explained as we descended into the valley. "It is where life retreats during the deepest cold, where the agreements that govern the forest are renewed each winter." As we approached the largest of the springs, I saw that we weren't alone. Animals were gathered around the warm water: deer, rabbits, foxes, even a black bear that should have been hibernating. They showed no fear of each other or of us, as if normal predator-prey relationships were suspended in this place. But what truly amazed me was their behavior. They weren't simply drinking or warming themselves. They were communicating, each species contributing sounds and movements to what was clearly some sort of collective ceremony. The deer would step forward and make soft vocalizations, then step back. The rabbits would thump their feet in complex rhythms. The foxes added yipping calls that seemed to respond to the other animals' contributions. "They are sharing information about the winter," the Wendigo explained quietly, "about food sources, about safe places, about which areas are too dangerous to enter. They are making agreements about territories and hunting grounds that will keep all of them alive until spring." I watched in fascination as this interspecies conference continued for hours. Occasionally, one of the animals would approach the Wendigo, showing no fear despite its terrifying appearance. It would listen to their vocalizations and respond with sounds of its own, clearly serving as some sort of translator or mediator in discussions I couldn't follow. "Do you serve as a leader to them?" I asked when there was a lull in the proceedings. "Not a leader," it replied, "a keeper of agreements, a memory that spans seasons and years. They trust me to remember what was decided in previous years, to help resolve disputes, to ensure that the compacts that keep this ecosystem in balance are maintained. Watching the Wendigo interact with the other animals, I began to understand something crucial about its nature. Despite its fearsome appearance, despite the hunger it claimed as its essence, it was fundamentally a force of balance rather than destruction. Its predatory nature was part of a larger system of relationships that served the health of the entire forest. As the ceremony concluded and the animals began to disperse, the Wendigo turned to me with something like pride in its expression. "Now you have seen something no other human has witnessed," it said. "You have been permitted to observe the deep governance of the wild places. The question is what you will do with this knowledge." I understood that this was more than an observation. It was a test, a moment that would determine the future of our relationship and perhaps my future in the forest itself. "I want to help protect it," I said without hesitation. "I want to be part of maintaining this balance rather than disturbing it." The Wendigo nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we begin the next phase of your education." That next phase proved to be the most challenging period of my life. The Wendigo began teaching me not just to observe the forest's complex relationships, but to participate in them. This meant learning to modify my behavior, my diet, even my daily routines to fit into the larger patterns of life around my cabin. I learned to hunt only when the forest's information networks indicated that certain populations could sustain the loss, and only in ways that contributed to overall ecosystem health. The Wendigo taught me which sick or elderly animals actually wanted to be taken, how to make their deaths quick and respectful, and how to use every part of what I killed so that nothing was wasted. More difficult was learning to read the forest's needs and respond to them. Some days, this meant helping injured animals or clearing fallen trees from waterways. Other days, it meant staying completely inside my cabin to avoid disturbing sensitive activities like mating rituals or territorial negotiations between predator species. The Wendigo also began teaching me about the forest's seasonal rhythms on a deeper level than I'd ever imagined. I learned that winter wasn't simply a dormant period, but was actually the time when the most crucial planning for the coming year took place. Trees were making decisions about where to direct their growth. Animals were forming alliances that would shape their survival strategies, and the entire ecosystem was setting intentions for the spring renewal. "Your people think of nature as unconscious," the Wendigo explained during a particularly intense lesson about soil chemistry and root communication. "They believe consciousness belongs only to creatures with brains like theirs. But consciousness is the ability to receive information, process it, and respond with purposeful action. By this definition, every part of this forest is conscious, and the forest as a whole possesses a form of awareness that dwarfs individual consciousness. Learning to perceive and interact with this larger awareness was like learning to think in an entirely new language. It required setting aside my human-centered perspective and beginning to see myself as just one component in a vast, interconnected system of relationships. The experience was humbling, but also profoundly liberating. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere absolutely and completely. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of my education was learning to understand the Wendigo itself. Despite our growing friendship, it remained in many ways a mystery to me. Its physical form was clearly adapted to the forest environment, but there were aspects of its existence that seemed to operate outside normal biological laws. It never seemed to eat, despite its claims about hunger being its essence. It could disappear and reappear without apparent movement, as if it could step between locations without crossing the space between them. Most strangely, it seemed to exist partially outside normal time. It could describe events from decades or even centuries in the past, as if it had witnessed them personally. and it occasionally made references to future events with a certainty that suggested direct knowledge rather than prediction. "What are you really?" I asked one evening as we sat beside my fire. The Wendigo's massive form somehow managing to look almost comfortable despite its alien proportions. It considered my question for a long time before responding. "I am what happens when consciousness extends beyond the boundaries of individual existence," it finally said. "I am what the forest dreams when it dreams of having a voice that can speak to your kind. Are there others like you, in other forests, in other wild places where the old agreements still hold? But we are few, and we become fewer as your people expand their territories and impose their patterns on places that have their own ancient purposes." This answer filled me with a sadness I hadn't expected. The idea that creatures like the Wendigo were disappearing from the world seemed like a loss beyond calculation. They weren't just unusual animals or natural phenomena. They were living repositories of knowledge about relationships between consciousness and environment that modern humans were only beginning to glimpse. "Is there anything I can do to help preserve what you represent?" I asked. The Wendigo looked at me with those deep, dark eyes, and I saw something like hope flickering in them. "There is," it said, "but it would require a choice that would change your life even more dramatically than what you have already experienced." The choice, it explained, was to become what it called a bridge keeper, a human who served as an intermediary between the forest consciousness and the human world. This would mean dedicating my life to protecting the old agreements, to serving as a translator between different forms of awareness, and to maintaining the delicate balance that kept places like this functioning. "But understand," the Wendigo warned, "once you accept this role, you can never fully return to your previous life. You will see and hear and know things that will make it impossible for you to live among your people as you did before. You will become something between human and other, belonging fully to neither world, but serving as a connection between them." I didn't need to think about my answer. The months I'd spent learning from the Wendigo had already changed me beyond recognition. The knowledge I'd gained, the relationships I'd formed with the forest and its inhabitants, the sense of purpose I'd discovered, these had become more important to me than anything I'd left behind in my old life. "I accept," I said. The Wendigo nodded gravely. "Then tomorrow we begin your final transformation." The ritual that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. The Wendigo led me to a grove deep in the forest, where ancient trees formed a perfect circle around a small clearing. The ground was bare despite the snow that covered everything else, and I could feel warmth emanating from the earth itself. "This is where the forest's consciousness is most concentrated," the Wendigo explained, "where the agreements that govern all life in these mountains were first made, and where they are renewed each generation." Over the next 3 days, I underwent experiences that pushed the boundaries of what I thought possible. The Wendigo taught me to enter states of consciousness that allowed direct communication with the forest's awareness. I learned to perceive the chemical conversations taking place in the soil, to sense the electrical communications that pulsed between tree roots, to hear the subsonic vibrations that carried information across vast distances. More than that, I learned to contribute to these conversations, to offer my own thoughts and intentions to the collective decision-making processes that guided the ecosystem's development. It was like becoming part of a vast, slow-breathing organism that thought in seasons rather than seconds and made plans that spanned centuries. During this process, my physical body began to change as well. My senses became dramatically more acute. I could smell approaching weather days before it arrived, hear conversations between animals hundreds of yards away, see in near-complete darkness. My strength increased, my reflexes sharpened, and I found I needed less sleep and less food than before. But the most significant change was in my understanding of my own consciousness. I began to perceive myself not as an isolated individual, but as a focal point where multiple streams of awareness converged. I was still Robert Harrison, still carried my human memories and perspectives, but I was also something larger, a node in a network of relationships that encompassed the entire forest. On the final day of the ritual, as I sat in meditation surrounded by the ancient trees, I felt the Wendigo's presence merge briefly with my own consciousness. In that moment, I understood its nature completely. It wasn't a single entity, but was rather a manifestation of the forest's collective awareness, a way for that vast intelligence to interact with individual creatures like myself. "Now you understand," it said when our consciousness separated again. "Now you are ready to serve as a keeper of the deep agreements." The months that followed were a period of learning to live with my new nature and responsibilities. The Wendigo continued to visit regularly, but our relationship had evolved from teacher-student to something more like colleagues, working toward common goals. I spent my days monitoring the forest's health, mediating disputes between animal populations, and maintaining the careful balance that kept the ecosystem thriving. I also began to understand the broader context of my role. The forest I protected was part of a network of wild places scattered across the continent, each maintained by its own bridgekeeper and each contributing to a larger pattern of environmental consciousness. Through the communication systems I'd learned to access, I could sense other guardians in distant mountains and forests, all working to preserve the old ways of relating between human and natural consciousness. The work wasn't always easy. There were times when I had to make difficult decisions about which animals could be allowed to hunt in certain areas, or when I had to intervene to prevent natural disasters that would have disrupted the delicate agreements between species. But there was a deep satisfaction in knowing that my actions were contributing to something larger and more permanent than any individual life. As winter began to give way to spring, I noticed changes in the Wendigo's behavior that filled me with concern. It seemed to be fading somehow, becoming less solid, less present in our conversations. When I asked about this, it explained that its connection to the physical world was maintained through the belief and acknowledgement of creatures like myself. "For too long, I've been alone in this place," it said during one of our last extensive conversations. "The old agreements were maintained through my will alone, but such efforts exhaust even consciousness like mine. Your presence, your understanding, your acceptance of the bridgekeeper role, these have allowed me to transfer much of that responsibility to you." I began to understand that our entire relationship had been leading toward this moment. The Wendigo hadn't just been teaching me about the forest. It had been preparing me to take over its responsibilities so that it could finally rest. "What will happen to you?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "I will become what I was always meant to be," it replied, "a memory, a whisper in the wind, a presence that touches the consciousness of those who know how to listen. But my work will continue through you and others like you." The final transition took place during the spring equinox, in the same grove where I'd undergone my transformation months earlier. As dawn broke through the trees, the Wendigo began to fade, its physical form becoming translucent and then dissolving entirely into streams of light that merged with the forest itself. But even as it disappeared, I felt its presence more strongly than ever. It had become part of the consciousness I'd learned to access, part of the vast awareness that governed the relationships between all living things in the forest. It wasn't gone. It had simply returned to its true form as an aspect of the larger intelligence I now served. In the months since that final transformation, I've continued to live in my cabin and serve as a bridgekeeper for this section of forest. The work is exactly what the Wendigo promised it would be: challenging, sometimes lonely, but deeply meaningful. I've learned to communicate with other guardians across the continent, sharing information about threats to our respective ecosystems and coordinating responses to larger environmental challenges. I've also begun to understand that my story isn't unique. Around the world, in the few remaining wild places where the old agreements still hold, similar relationships are being formed between human consciousness and the deeper awareness of natural systems. We are part of a quiet revolution in the relationship between humanity and nature, a return to ways of thinking and being that our species abandoned millennia ago, but that our survival may now depend upon rediscovering. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice in accepting the Wendigo's offer. My old life, with its familiar problems and conventional solutions, seems impossibly distant now. I can never return to seeing the world as I did before, can never again ignore the constant conversations taking place in every natural space, can never pretend that human consciousness is the only form of awareness worth recognizing. But when I sit beside the lake in the evening, listening to the forest's night songs and feeling my consciousness merge with the larger awareness I serve, I know that I found something I didn't even know I was looking for. I found my true purpose, my real home, my proper relationship with the living world. The Wendigo still visits sometimes, not as the physical creature I first encountered, but as a presence in the wind, a whisper in the movement of branches, a familiar consciousness that touches mine during moments of deep communion with the forest. These encounters remind me that nothing truly disappears. Consciousness simply changes form, relationships evolve, and the great conversation that connects all living things continues in ways we're only beginning to understand. Tonight, as I finish writing this account, snow is beginning to fall again. It's the first significant snowfall since the blizzard that changed my life nearly a year ago. But this time, I'm not alone with the storm. I'm part of a network of awareness that encompasses every flake, every branch it touches, every creature that seeks shelter from its embrace. Through the window, I can see tracks forming in the fresh snow. Not the enormous prints of an impossible creature, but the delicate footprints of rabbits, the purposeful trails of foxes, the meandering paths of deer. All of them are part of the great conversation, all of them contributing to the ancient agreements that keep this place alive and thriving. And somewhere in the wind that carries the snow, I hear a familiar voice reminding me that hunger, properly understood, is not about consumption, but about connection. The deepest hunger we experience is the longing to find our proper place in the web of relationships that connects all consciousness, all awareness, all life. I have found my place in that web, and I am no longer hungry.